Page number 207. Works of Byron. In reading Byron, it is well to remember that he was a disappointed and embittered man, not only in his personal life but also in his expectation of a general transformation of human society. As he pours out his own feelings, chiefly in his poetry, he is the most expressive writer of his age in voicing the discontent of a multitude of Europeans who were disappointed at the failure of the French Revolution to produce an entirely new form of government and society. One who wishes to understand the whole scope of Byron's genius and poetry will do well to begin with his first work, Hours of Idleness, written when he was a young man at the university. There is very little poetry in the volume, only a striking facility in rhyme, brightened by the devil-may-care spirit of the Cavalier poets, but as a revelation of a man himself, it is remarkable. In a vain and sophomoric, sophomoric preface, he declares that poetry is to him an idle experiment and that it is his first and last attempt to amuse himself in that line. Curiously enough, as he starts for Greece on his last fatal journey, he again ridicules literature and says that the poet is a mere babbler. It is this despising of the art which alone makes him famous that occasions our deepest disappointment. Even in his magnificent passages, in a glowing description of nature or of a Hindu woman's exquisite love, his work is frequently marred by a wretched pun or by some cheap buffoonery which ruins our first splendid impression of his poetry. Byron's later volumes, Manfred and Cain, the one a curious and perhaps unconscious parody of Faust, the other of Paradise Lost, are his two best known dramatic works. Aside from the question of their poetic value, they are interesting as voicing Byron's excessive individualism and his rebellion against society. The best known and the most readable of Byron's works are Mazeppa, The Prisoner of Chillon, and The Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. The first two cantos of Childe Harold 1812 are perhaps more frequently read than any other work of the same author, partly because of their melodious verse, partly because of their descriptions of places along the lines of European travel, but the last two cantos, written after his exile from England, have more sincerity and are in every way better expressions of Byron's matured genius. Scattered through all his works, one finds magnificent descriptions of natural scenery and exquisite lyrics of love and despair, but they are mixed with such a deal of bombast and rhetoric, together with much that is unwholesome, that the beginner will do well to confine himself to a small volume of well-chosen selections. Byron is often compared with Scott as having given to us Europe and the Orient, just as Scott gave us Scotland and its people, but while there is a certain resemblance in the swing and dash of the verses, the resemblance is all on the surface, and the underlying difference between the two poets is as great as that between Thackeray and Bulwer Lytton. Scott knew his country well, its hills and valleys, which are interesting as the abode of living and lovable men and women. Byron pretended to know the secret, unwholesome side of Europe, which generally hides itself in the dark. But instead of giving us a variety of living men, he never gets away from his own unbalanced and egoistical self. All his characters in Cain, Manfred, the Corsair, the Gayor, Childe Harold, Don Juan are tiresome repetitions of himself, a vain, disappointed, cynical man who finds no good in life or love or anything. Naturally, with such a disposition, he is entirely incapable of portraying a true woman. To nature alone, especially in her magnificent moods, Byron remains faithful, and his portrayal of the night and the storm and the ocean in Childe Harold are unsurpassed in our language. Percy Bysshe Shelley, 1792 to 1822. Make me thy lyre, even as the forest is. What if my leaves are falling like its own? The tumult of their mighty harmonies will take from both a deep autumnal tone. Sweet though in sadness, be thou spirit fierce, my spirit, be thou me, impetuous one. In this fragment from the Ode to the West Wind, we have a suggestion of Shelley's own spirit as reflected in all his poetry, the very spirit of nature which appeals to us in the wind and the cloud, the sunset and the moonrise, seems to have possessed him at times and made him a chosen instrument of melody. At such times he is a true poet and his work is unrivaled. At other times, unfortunately, Shelley joins with Byron in voicing a vain rebellion against society. End of page 207, now page 208. His poetry, his life, divides itself into two distinct moods. In one, he is the violent reformer, seeking to overthrow our present institutions and to hurry the millennium out of its slow walk into a gallop. Out of this mood come most of his longer poems like Queen Mab, Revolt of Islam, Hellas and the Witch of Atlas, which are somewhat violent diatribes against government, priests, marriage, religion, even God, as men suppose him to be. In a different mood, which finds expression in Alistair, Adonais, and his wonderful lyrics, Shelley is like a wanderer following a vague, beautiful vision, forever sad and forever unsatisfied. In the latter mood, he appeals profoundly to all men who have known what it is to follow after an unattainable ideal. Works of Shelley. As a lyric poet, Shelley is one of the supreme geniuses of our literature, and the reader will do well to begin with the poems which show him at his very best. The Cloud, To a Skylark, Ode to the West Wind, To Night. Poems like these must surely set the reader to searching among Shelley's miscellaneous works to find for himself the things worthy to be remembered. In reading Shelley's longer poems, one must remember that there are in this poet two distinct men, one the wanderer seeking ideal beauty and forever unsatisfied, the other the unbalanced reformer seeking to overthrow of present institutions and the establishment of universal happiness. Alistair, or the Spirit of Solitude, 1816, is by far the best expression of Shelley's greater mood. Here we see him wandering restlessly through the vast silences of nature. in search of a loved dream maiden who shall satisfy his love of beauty. Here Shelley is the poet on the moon rays and the tender, exquisite fancies that can never be expressed. The charm of the poem lies in its succession of dreamlike pictures, but it gives absolutely no impressions of reality. It was written when Shelley, after his long struggle, had begun to realize that the world was too strong for him. Alastor is therefore the poet's confession, not simply of failure, but of undying hope in some better thing that is to come. Prometheus Unbound, 1818 to 1820, a lyrical drama, is the best work of Shelley's revolutionary enthusiasm and the most characteristic of all his poems. Shelley's philosophy, if one may dignify a hopeless dream by such a name, was a curious aftergrowth of the French Revolution, namely that it is only the existing tyranny of state, church and society which keeps man from growth into perfect happiness. Naturally, Shelley forgot, like many other enthusiasts, that the church and the state and social laws were not imposed upon man from without, but were created by himself to minister to his necessities. In Shelley's poem, the hero Prometheus represents mankind itself, a just and noble humanity chained and tortured by Jove, Jove, who is here the personification of human institutions. In due time, Demogorgon, which is Shelley's name for necessity, overthrows the tyrant, Jove, and releases Prometheus, mankind, who is presently united to Asia, the spirit of love and the goodness in nature, while the earth and the moon join in a wedding song, and everything gives promise that they shall live together happily ever afterwards. Shelley here looks forward, not back, to the golden age and is the prophet of science and evolution. If we compare his Titan with similar characters in Faust and Cain, we shall find this interesting difference, that while Goethe's Titan is cultured and self-reliant and Byron's stoic and hopeless, Shelley's hero is patient under torture, seeing help and hope beyond his suffering. And he marries love that the earth may be peopled with superior beings who shall substitute brotherly love for the present laws and conventions of society. Such is his philosophy, but the beginner will read this poem not chiefly for its thought, but for its youthful enthusiasm, for its marvelous imagery, and especially for its ethereal music. Perhaps we should add here that Prometheus is, and probably always will be, a poem for the chosen few who can appreciate its particular spirit like beauty. In its purely pagan conception of the world, it suggests by contrast Milton's Christian philosophy in Paradise Regained. Shelley's revolutionary works, Queen Mab 1813, The Revolt of Islam 1818, Hellas 1821 and The Witch of Atlas 1820 are to be judged in much the same way as is Prometheus Unbound. They are largely invectives against religion, marriage, kingcraft and priestcraft, most impractical when considered as schemes for reform, but abounding in passages of exquisite beauty for which alone they are worth reading. In the drama called the Sensei 19, which is founded upon a morbid Italian story, Shelley for the first and only time descends to reality. End of page 208, now page 209. The heroine Beatrice, driven to desperation by the monstrous wickedness of her father, kills him and suffers the death penalty in consequence. She is the only one of Shelley's characters who seems to us entirely human. Far different in character is Epipsychidion, Epipsychidion, Epipsychidion. 1821, a rhapsody celebrating platonic love, the most impalpable and so one of the most characteristic of Shelley's works. It was inspired by a beautiful Italian girl, Emilia Viviani, who was put into a cloister against her will, and in whom Shelley imagined he found his long-sought ideal of womanhood. With this should be read Adonai, the best known of all Shelley's longer poems. Adonai is a wonderful threnody, Thrенody, threnody, or a song of grief over the death of the poet Keats. Even in his grief, Shelley still preserves a sense of unreality and calls in many shadowy allegorical figures: sad spring, weeping hours, glooms, splendors, destinies, all uniting in bewailing the loss of a loved one. The whole poem is a succession of dream pictures, exquisitely beautiful, such as only Shelley could imagine, and it holds its place with Milton's Lycidas and Tennyson in memoriam as one of the three greatest elegies in our language. In his interpretation of nature, Shelley suggests Wordsworth, both by resemblance and by contrast. To both poets, all natural objects are symbols of truth. Both regard nature as permeated by the great spiritual life which animates all things, but while Wordsworth finds a spirit of thought and so communion between nature and the soul of man, Shelley finds a spirit of love which exists chiefly for its own delight. And to the cloud, the skylark, and the west wind, three of the most beautiful poems in our language, have no definite message for humanity. In his Hymn to Intellectual Beauty, Shelley is most like Wordsworth, but in his Sensitive Plant, with its fine symbolism and imagery, he is like nobody in the world but himself. Comparison is sometimes an excellent thing, and if we compare Shelley's exquisite lament, beginning, O world, O life, O time, with Wordsworth's imitations of immortality, we shall perhaps understand both poets better. Both poems recall many happy memories of youth, both express a very real mood of a moment, but while the beauty of one merely saddens and disheartens us, the beauty of the other inspires us with something of the poet's own faith and hopefulness. In a word, Wordsworth found and Shelley lost himself in nature. John Keats, 1795 to 1821. Keats was not only the last but also the most perfect of the Romanticists. While Scott was merely telling stories and Wordsworth reforming poetry or upholding the moral law, and Shelley advocating impossible reforms, and Byron voicing his own egoism and the political discontent of the times, Keats lived apart from men and from all political measures, worshipping beauty like a devotee, perfectly content to write what was in his own heart, or to reflect some splendor of the natural world as he saw or dreamed it to be. He had, moreover, the novel idea that poetry exists for its own sake and suffers loss by being devoted to philosophy or politics, or indeed to any cause, however great or small. As he says in Lamia, "Do not all charms fly at the mere touch of cold philosophy? There was an awful rainbow once in heaven. We know her woof, her texture, she is given in all the dull catalogue of common things. Philosophy will clip an angel's wings, conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air and gnomed mine, unweave a rainbow as it a while made the tender person's lamia melt into a shade." Partly because of this high ideal of poetry, partly because he studied and unconsciously imitated the Greek classics and the best works of the Elizabethans, Keats' last little volume of poetry is unequaled by the work of any of his contemporaries. When we remember that all his work was published in 3 short years, from 1817 to 1820, and that he died when only 25 years old, we must judge him to be the most promising figure of the early 19th century and one of the most remarkable in the history of English literature. The works of Keats: "None but the master shall praise us, and none but the master shall blame," might well be written on the fly-leaf of every volume of Keats' poetry. For never was there a poet more devoted to his ideal, entirely independent of success or failure. In strong contrast with his contemporary Byron, who professed to despise the art that made him famous, Keats lived for poetry alone, and as Lowell pointed out, a virtue went out of him into everything he wrote. End of page 209, now page 210. In all his work, we have the impression of his intense loyalty to his art. We have the impression also of a profound dissatisfaction that the deed falls so far short of the splendid dream. Thus, after reading Chapman's translation of Homer, he writes, "Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wild expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien." In this striking sonnet, we have a suggestion of Keats' high ideal and of his sadness because of his own ignorance when he published his first little volume of poems in 1817. He knew no Greek, yet Greek literature absorbed and fascinated him as he saw its broken and imperfect reflection in an English translation. Like Shakespeare, who also was but poorly educated in the schools, he had a marvelous faculty of discerning the real spirit of the classics, a faculty denied to many great scholars and to most of the classic writers of the preceding century. And so he set himself to the task of reflecting in modern English the spirit of the old Greeks. The imperfect results of this attempt are seen in his next volume, Endymion, which is the story of a young shepherd beloved by a moon goddess. The poem begins with the striking lines, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever, its loveliness increases." The imperfect results of this attempt are seen in his next volume, Endymion, which is the story of a young shepherd boy beloved by a moon goddess. The poem begins with the striking lines, a thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases, it will never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us, and a sleep full of sweet dreams and health and quiet breathing, which well illustrate the spirit of Keats' later work with its perfect finish and melody. It has many quotable lines and passages, and its hymn to Pan should be read in connection with Wordsworth's famous sonnet beginning, "The world is too much with us." The poem gives splendid promise, but as a whole it is rather chaotic, with too much ornament and too little design, like a modern house. That Keats felt his defect strongly is evident from his modest preface, wherein he speaks of Endymion not as a deed accomplished, but only as an unsuccessful attempt to suggest the underlying beauty of Greek mythology. Keats' third and last volume, Lamia, Isabella, The Eve of St. Agnes, and Other Poems, 1820, is the one with which the reader should begin his acquaintance with this master of English verse. It has only two subjects, Greek mythology and medieval romance. Hyperion is a magnificent fragment suggesting the first arch of a cathedral that was never finished. Its theme is the overthrow of the Titans by the young sun god Apollo. Realizing his own immaturity and lack of knowledge, Keats laid aside this work, and only the pleadings of his publisher induced him to print the fragment with his completed poems. Throughout this last volume, and especially in Hyperion, the influence of Milton is apparent, while Spenser is more frequently suggested in reading Endymion. Of the longer poems in the volume, Lamia is the most suggestive. It is the story of a beautiful enchantress who turns from a serpent into a glorious woman and fills every human sense with delight, until, as a result of the foolish philosophy of old Apollonius, she vanishes forever from her lover's sight. The Eve of St. Agnes, the most perfect of Keats' medieval poems, is not a story after the manner of the metrical romances, but rather a vivid painting of a romantic mood, such as comes to all men at times to glorify a workday world. Like all the work of Keats and Shelley, it has an element of unreality, and when we read at the end, "And they are gone, aye, ages long ago, these lovers fled away into the storm," it is as if we were waking from a dream, which is the only possible ending to all of Keats' Greek and medieval fancies. We are to remember, however, that no beautiful thing, though it is intangible as a dream, can enter a man's life and leave him quite the same afterwards. Keats' own words is here suggestive. The imagination, he said, may be likened to Adam's dream. He woke and he found it true. End of page number 210, now 211. It is by his short poems that Keats is known to the majority of present-day readers. Among these exquisite shorter poems, we mention only the 4 odes on a Grecian urn, to a nightingale, to autumn, and to Psyche. These are like an invitation to a feast. One who reads them will hardly be satisfied until he knows more of such delightful poetry. Those who study only the ode to a nightingale may find 4 things: a love of sensuous beauty, a touch of pessimism, a purely pagan conception of nature, and a strong individualism, which are characteristic of this last of the Romantic poets. As Wordsworth's work is too marred by the moralizer, and Byron by the demagogue, and Shelley by the reformer, so Keats' work suffers from the opposite extreme of aloofness from every human interest, so much so that he is often accused of being indifferent to humanity. His work is also criticized as being too effeminate for ordinary readers. Three things should be remembered in this connection. First, that Keats sought to express beauty for its own sake, that beauty is as essential to normal humanity as is government or law, and that the higher man climbs in civilization, the more imperative becomes his need of beauty as a reward for his labors. Second, that Keats' letters are as much an indication of the man as his poetry, and in his letters with their human sympathy, their eager interest in social problems, their humor, and their keen insight into life, there is no trace of effeminacy, but rather every indication of a strong and noble manhood. The third thing we remember is that all Keats' work was done in 3 or 4 years with small preparation, and that, dying at 25, he left us a body of poetry which will always be one of the most cherished possessions. He is often compared with the marvelous boy Chatterton, whom he greatly admired and to whose memory he dedicated his Endymion. But though both died young, Chatterton was but a child, while Keats was in all respects a man. It is idle to prophesy that what he might have done had he been granted a Tennyson's long life and scholarly training. At 25, his work was as mature as Tennyson's at 50, though the maturity suggests the too rapid growth of a tropical plant which, under the warm rains and the flood of sunlight, leaps into life, grows, blooms in a day, and dies. As we have stated, Keats' work was bitterly and unjustly condemned by the critics of his day. He belonged to what was derisively called the Cockney school of poetry, of which Leigh Hunt was chief, and Proctor and Beddoes were fellow workmen. Not even from Wordsworth and Byron, who were ready enough to recommend far less gifted writers, did Keats receive the highest encouragement. Like young Lochinvar, he rode all unarmed, and he rode all alone. Shelley, with his sincerity and generosity, was the first to recognize the young genius, and in his noble Adonai, written, alas, like most of our tributes, when the subject of our praise is dead, he spoke the first true word of appreciation and placed Keats where he unquestionably belongs among our greatest poets. The fame denied him in his sad life was granted freely after his death. Most fitly does he close the list of poets of the Romantic Revival, because in many respects he was the best workman of them all. He seems to have studied words more carefully than did his contemporaries, and so his poetic expression, or the harmony of word and thought, is generally more perfect than theirs. More than any other, he lived for poetry as the noblest of the arts. More than any other, he emphasized beauty because to him, as shown by his Grecian urn, beauty and truth were one and inseparable. And he enriched the whole Romantic movement by adding to its interest in common life the spirit rather than the letter of the classics and the Elizabethan poetry. For these reasons, Keats is, like Spenser, a poet's poet. His work profoundly influenced Tennyson and indeed most of the poets of the present era.